I'm Professor Margaret Blair at Vanderbilt Law School, and I'm just delighted to be here, and I'm so appreciative of our organizers, Pradeep and Yesha and Susan and Randall. I know enormous amount of effort was put in to make this happen, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of it. I'm going to kick off this morning by talking about an idea which used to be very common in the literature, and then it sort of went out of fashion. And this is the idea that one of the functions of boards of directors has to do with balancing competing interests and being able to work through problems when different groups are competing for the same corporate assets. So I'll just get started right away. Two topics of conversation that have been on the table for the last 15 years at least. People have been talking about them. Neither one seems to be going away or dying in deference to the other, and that is the idea of corporate governance and how important it is that we get our governance institutions in place to be able to manage all of the issues. And among finance people, that usually means focusing on share value. And the idea that corporations, we also need as a societies to have corporations have some sense of social responsibility to the larger community. So these have been hot topics in the US, they've been hot topics in India, they have been for some period of time. I don't think we haven't said all we're going to say about either of these topics. There was a change in Indian law about 3 years ago, I think, which now requires that larger publicly traded corporations must spend at least 2% of their profits on corporate social responsibility. And I understand that what is meant by that is still a little vague, how that actually works in practice. And I also understand that it's not, that the penalty for not doing this is simply the sort of effect on the reputation of the corporations, because it's a comply or explain kind of rule rather than one that carries with it certain penalties if it's not met. A major concern that gets repeated in the West in corporate governance circles, and it's been repeated in the literature on the change in India that requires corporate social responsibility, is that corporate managers cannot serve two masters. So that phrase goes all the way back to the Bible. Okay, I may go beyond that, but it is a concept that shows up in the Hebrew Bible, and that is the problem, that if corporate managers are supposed to be maximizing share value, that if we also ask them to pay attention to social responsibility, they will end up wasting resources. This will be a cover for them doing things that they shouldn't otherwise do. I'm here to suggest that the conventional wisdom on this may be, it may have merit in its own way, but it's not getting at the full truth of what corporate directors do. So corporations have always been, as far back as I've been able to trace it, they have been contexts in which management and boards must be involved in balancing and resolving competing interests. Among the many competing interests in any corporation, in the interests of the government that grants the charter versus the interests of the private investors. The interests of different classes of investors, for example, creditors versus shareholders, or preferred shareholders versus common shareholders. The interests of a controlling shareholder versus minority shareholders. The interests of the entrepreneurial founder of a corporation versus the outside investors who come in and put money in. The interests of financial investors versus other stakeholders. If you just give it a little bit of thought, you realize all of these interests are competing, and the discussions of corporate governance that have centered on financial questions have tended to focus on one set of conflicts between managers and shareholders. But that's clearly not enough. The other things have to be happening too. So the fact that there's all this controversy and competition, I think, provides some insight into why corporations are universally governed by boards of directors. This is true around the world. The conventional wisdom that goes back to Jensen and Meckling in 1976, says that directors are supposed to act as agents of shareholders. This rhetoric really didn't enter the conversation until about the 1980s. During the 1980s, the role of corporate directors came to be viewed as one of maximizing share value. But history tells us something different if we go back and we look at what corporate boards of directors actually did. Now, I have to concede the data on this is slim, and so I'm going to extrapolate from a long string of anecdotes. Boards were used in the earliest of the business corporations. So we go all the way back to the joint stock companies. I'll say a few words about the East India Company, for example. The concept that the governance structure should be by boards goes all the way back. Boards were the preferred governance device in organizations that had multiple competing interests and goals. Boards were often structured so that they could mediate among all these different competing interests. Now, I'm going to suggest, because this is what I've been talking about for the past decade or so in my career, that this history may be better explained by a team production theory than by standard finance theory. So what do I mean by team production theory? Some of you may be familiar with it, but a lot of you are probably not, so let me say a few words. The concept of team production was defined by Alshin and Demsetz in 1972. They said that if you have a production process in which inputs are needed from a large number of different people, inputs are complex, difficult to specify or measure, and very difficult to contract over, and the output is non-separable. In that context, they suggested that the solution should be to let one of the team members be the owner and make all the decisions and capture all the economic surplus. Now, Oliver Hart came along and embellished on this, one of our Nobel laureates for this year. He said that to own something means to have the right to make the residual decisions with respect to that asset. And he suggested that the solution then is to let the person who contributes the most important asset be the owners and be given this right to make the residual decisions. Now, some people that you may know, on the left there is Raghuram Rajan, who's a very famous person here in India, and his co-author, Luigi Zingalis, a number of years ago, did some very interesting work that suggested that ownership of the assets may not be the ideal solution in a corporate context. They said that ownership actually creates perverse incentives. Why is that? Because the owner of the asset that's used jointly by a large number of people will have the incentive to try to expropriate value from those others who must invest in other kinds of assets like human capital that are difficult to recover if they're not used in connection with the particular assets. So their solution was to let an outsider to the team make the residual decisions, okay? Our other Nobel laureate for 2016, Bengt Holmström, actually had suggested something very similar to that in a famous paper he wrote using the phrase team production. He may be the first one that after Alshin and Demsetz to use that language. And he suggested the same idea, that the parties that should own the assets and make these residuals decisions should be someone who's actually not on the team. In 1999, I did some joint work with Professor Lynn Stout, and we argue that if you take these arguments seriously, it may help explain the role of boards of directors of corporations. So how does corporate law help solve the team production problem? Well, first of all, it says that all business assets and outputs are owned not by any individuals, but by the corporation itself. The corporation is a separate legal entity, and it owns the assets. Secondly, it says that all corporate powers are vested in a board of directors. So this means none of the actual team members can make all of the decisions. Any authority that team members exercise has been delegated by the board, but the original authority lies with the board. And it happens that in most companies, board members are outsiders to the team, most board members. And board members have no power individually. They do not own corporate assets, so they can't individually make the decisions. They can only make the decisions as in context of the board acting as a whole. The role of the board frequently is to mediate, to balance competing interests that help to keep the team together. Now, arbitration theory, interestingly, this is some work I came to appreciate somewhat more recently. It points to the same solution. A model from Brian Bruffman said, he puts it in the context of venture capital firms. And he says, suppose an entrepreneur owns common stock and the venture capitalist owns preferred stock. Well, you've obviously got a conflict of interest set up already. The entrepreneur favors high-risk, high-return ventures because the entrepreneur captures the residual gain and doesn't lose that much. They're protected on the downside. The venture capitalist, however, favors lower risk, lower return ventures. So how is that decided? So Professor Bruffman says, perhaps, suppose there's an intermediate project that creates less value for each of the individual parties, both the venture capitalist and the entrepreneur, than their preferred venture, but more total social value. If a mediator is going to make the call as to which of the projects to choose, based on the recommendations of the parties that are actually involved, the team members, both of them will have an incentive to moderate their demands and recommend the intermediate strategy. Because they know that this other party is going to make the call, they won't necessarily insist on the highest return strategy for that person if it disadvantages the other party. And it's true, the other thing that's true is that if you go down the list of things that corporate law mandates, what are the decisions that are mandated under corporate law that must be made by the board of directors, where the board holds the authority as dictated in corporate law? Now, I'm basing my arguments here on the Model Business Corporation Act in the United States, but it's very similar in Delaware law, and I have to admit, I don't know for certain that it's true in India, but some of the research on comparative corporate governance have suggested that many of these matters are left to the responsibility of the board. Hiring and firing a CEO, loaded with conflict. Compensation of the CEO and of the board itself. Plan for merger, dissolution, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I'm getting my signal over here. You go through the list. So I've gone back and I've looked at historical examples. If you look at the East India Company, the company was founded in 1600. The charter was delegated authority to a governor, a deputy governor, and 24 committees is the phrase they use in the charter itself. And they are equivalent to directors. The directors governed trading rights among their members, okay? Members competed with each other within the trading area that was defined by the charter. Among the jobs of the committees was to adjudicate disputes among the members. You look at the London Company, which later became called the Virginia Company. They were governed by a council. The charters of the early trading companies in the United States became the model or the template on which the state legislatures were formed. These bodies would certainly have been balancing competing interests. In the early states, each charter was created by a separate act of the legislature. The corporations were formed to serve local communities by providing infrastructure projects, bridges, canals, waterworks, and such. And financial services, banks and insurance company. Virtually all of the early corporations were in one of these areas. They were entitled to earn some profits, okay? But profit wasn't the point. The point was that they were supposed to provide these services to the community, and they were allowed to make a profit as a reward for that, but there was no talk about maximizing profit. They did not make distinction in those days between for-profit and not-for-profit corporations. What do we know about who served on boards of directors? Well, we know very little, actually, and this is sort of where I want to go with some of my research. But what we have, I'm getting the hook here. I'm about to be pulled out of. We know they were prominent members of the business community. They were shareholders, but not all corporate board members were shareholders. Some tended to represent the customers of the corporation. And almost certainly, the directors were respected citizens whose job was to overcome the political resistance in the electorate, in the legislatures, so that the charter would be granted in the first place. So I'm not quite finished, but I'm going to stop right there because that's a good stopping place that basically makes the point that I want to make. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Margaret. Okay.